Okay, this is actually take two. I did another take that was interrupted by a text message. And that take didn't really go well. It was kind of meandering and I couldn't really get my thoughts together. So, hopefully, this will be a little more focused and on track. Uh, I'm doing this video because I kind of feel the need to just express my thoughts and feelings, basically put out there what I'm thinking and what I'm experiencing right now, just my thoughts and all that stuff, all that razzmatazz, if you will. And the reason why I'm doing this is I about 6 months ago, I by accident, interestingly enough, ended up watching a YouTube video about MBTI personality types. And that kind of served as a jumping off point for me to begin reading and watching more videos and kind of develop an interest in MBTI typology as a whole. And the more I read and the more I watched, the more I discovered that I was looking for an answer to a question I didn't realize I had, or that I was stumbling on a possible answer to a question that I didn't know I was asking. So I ended up taking several, and by several actually I mean a couple dozen different online typology tests. The vast majority of them concluded that I was the INFJ personality type. And I'm going to preface this by saying, I know everybody under the sun is either an INFJ or wants to be an INFJ or thinks they're an INFJ because it's the cool kid thing to do. And I'm going to tell you, if being an INFJ is what my experience has been, I would not wish it on anyone. I mean, I really would not wish this on anyone because my experience has been a life filled with a level of alienation and awkwardness with other human beings on such a fundamental level, like such a deep core root level of, I guess you could say, difference of nature. And through my reading and all the videos I watched and my other study and a lot of actual real world experimentation, believe it or not, because I used to do experiments where I'd go into crowded environments and I'd watch and I'd observe people in social interactions and kind of trying to figure out, what exactly the strengths and weaknesses and the unique quirks of having an INFJ personality are. And not to say that it's all bad, it isn't, but getting through your day as an INFJ requires a level of very deliberate diligence. Like, you kind of have to really manage yourself and manage your day, your environment on a moment to moment level, because you kind of have to factor in all the weird quirks that come with it, the INFJ desire to frickin' kind of know how things are going to play out in advance, the desire to create elaborate plans for how you're going to do things, wanting to be certain about your actions, and when things kind of go awry or something comes out of left field, unexpected that you didn't already have a plan for, how it can really screw you up. Like, I'm still amazed, and I'm 35. I'm still amazed that I can have a day going very well, very smoothly, and sometimes, I get through days like I'm just floating on air and freaking making every proper move and getting everything done and making every decision is almost effortless. I mean, like I don't even have to try and I succeed. Like I just know, you know. I have days like that, and those days are actually quite nice. Those days I feel pretty good, and those are the days where I don't really have any issues with. I guess what the word I choose to use is my nature. Through studying MBTI typology, Myers-Briggs, all that stuff. Cognitive function stacks, and the letters, if you will. I'm just gonna be stupid and silly about it. I'll call it learning the letters, and then learning what they mean, how they relate to one another, and by what they mean, I mean what they actually mean. Not just, oh, you're ESTP, so you're a jock, or you're an ISTJ, or you're a INTJ, or INFP, or ENFP, or ESTJ, whatever. You know, People are complicated and people are unique. And the thing that a lot of people seem to miss about typology is that, yes, it can identify the fundamental ways that a brain, ergo a mind, prefers to perceive and make decisions about the reality around them. And I just had word salad right there. Apologies. I'm an amateur, not a professional in any way. And I'm just kind of putting my thoughts out there, really for my own reasons. Believe me, I am not trying to start a YouTube channel and get a bunch of subscribers and stuff like that. That is very much not my thing. I don't really want to have to manage y'all. I don't want to have to worry about freaking subscriber counts or comments. Honestly, I'm the kind of person where if I never heard from any of y'all, I'd kind of be happier for it. That is not to say that I don't like you. It's not to say I have anything against you. It's just, I'm not doing it for that purpose. I'm doing this almost as a journal, I suppose. First attempt was writing poetry, which actually didn't go bad. I might try my hand at it again. I don't consider myself a very good poet or writer by any means, but when the mood strikes me, I'll put whatever comes into my head down, and interestingly enough, sometimes it flows. I'm digressing. It's going to be a recurring issue with this video, and probably any other one I have, is digressing and going off on tangents. I'll try to avoid that to make this less painful on whoever may actually end up seeing this video. So bear with me. But anyways, people are unique. They're individuals. They have a breadth and body of experience, and their overall personality is shaped by that experience. But there is a caveat to that. The caveat is that people all still have fundamental natures. MBTI properly categorizes, for the most part, and quantifies those natures and gives them names so you can understand them and find context. I know that sounds a little lectury, but this is my video. See, that's me asserting my personality, my sense of self. My video, my rules. So, I guess the easiest analogy to me, the one that I can make sense to other people, it's not the analogy that I personally like, it's the one that I can seem to get across to other people and get some kind of comprehension, is MBTI is analogous to the different makes and models of cars, automobiles. You've got your different makes, Ford, Chevy, Dodge, Lincoln, Mercury, all that. And you got your models, is it a sedan, a truck, minivan, So the way I explain it is that people are born being a certain make and model of vehicle. The make and model being analogous to their personality type, which is how their brain prefers to function on a moment-to-moment basis. So, if the world is, they call a sensor world, a world where people tend to see things in terms of surface level concrete reality, what's there is there, and don't worry about underlying meanings behind it, then we'll call them Ford. Ford's one of the most common automobiles out there, and that's appropriate because if people who identify with Ford are sensors, then over 70% of the world's population is filled with sensors. Now, you also have intellectuals and intuitives. People who either lead with, a thinking perception or a intuitive perception. INTJs, classic intellectuals, classic thinkers, very much about, introverted thinking. If I have it right, keep in mind, sometimes I get the classifications messed up. I am not an expert, and honestly, the lettering system is, to me, not the most intuitive, pun there. It's not the most intuitive way of categorizing people. Sometimes I get it wrong. But the majority of the world is filled with sensor types, and society is very much geared towards sensors. That's something, it took me a long time to kind of comprehend and really get, that I wasn't just weird, or I wasn't just losing my mind. What I was experiencing throughout life was a real thing and something that does happen to other people. It's not every day you come to learn that you're part of a demographic that makes up less than 0.5% of the world's population. That's kind of big. That's a big thing to take in. So, where am I going with this? So yeah, the car analogy. God, I'm horrible at taking YouTube videos. This is my first one. So if 70% of the world's population is made up with Ford, and say 30% is made up of, either, let's call it some obscure thing like maybe Subaru or Hyundai or Maybe we'll give him something cool like a Fiat or a Rolls Royce, not nearly as common, not nearly as seen. Well, if we're using the vehicle make and model analogy, then being an INFJ is like being a goddamn DeLorean. Like there aren't many of you out there, and it always feels like there's no one making any more of them. It's in a depressing way. One could easily look at it as being part of an endangered species. It's a way I try to avoid looking at it, but more than once that thought has come to mind, and it's kind of disturbing. But yeah, so introverted intuition, the mystical, magical, very difficult to explain dominant cognitive function. There are so many people who can explain this better than me. So many. Introverted intuition is, it's like coming to a conclusion without fully understanding how you got there, but knowing that your answer is correct. Like getting an answer but not knowing how you got it. That's kind of how it feels. It's been described as the quintessential aha moment. Where you have this crystal clear image. Like if someone asks you a question about why a person did something, if say you have a coworker who doesn't like the way another coworker behaves or has done something, and they don't know why they're doing that thing. If you're an INFJ, what'll often happen is you'll ponder it for a moment, like just kind of meditate and like, I wouldn't call it thinking, but because it kind of isn't thinking. You're kind of just there in that zen-ish kind of state where you're just receiving the data and then letting it sit in the back of your head and not really trying to force it, not really trying to think it through. And then all of a sudden, you'll have this moment where it all falls into crystal clarity. It's like seeing a puzzle assemble itself right in front of you. It's like seeing a blurry image suddenly come into focus. You have the answer. And it's less about that you don't really know how you got it. It's that it is almost impossible to articulate it to someone. Like you kind of do know how you got the answer, but conveying it to another person, especially if they're a censor, oh my god, a censor will fucking stare at you with a blank look like you were freaking speaking in tongues. It's hard. The things that we have going on in our heads are not well suited to vocal communication. Like, talking is an extremely poor means of conveying what's going on in our heads. It's not adequate to the task. The shit going on up in my head needs a better way of communicating, a better language than what's available now. That's kind of the root problem. It's it would be so much easier if I could just take my thoughts and ideas, the things going on in my head, my rationales for coming to conclusions, and just like do the quote unquote Vulcan mind meld so another person can see it like I do. That would probably eliminate 99% of the issues of being an INFJ. You know, if you just be like, hey, I know why this is going on, or I know why this person is acting this way. Just, let's put four heads together and I'll freaking beam it into you and you'll see it the way I do and you'll get what I'm trying to convey. That would be fantastic. Because INFJ thought processes, our way of brain functioning, emphasizes a level of fidelity and nuance that is just lost in human language. I can come to a conclusion that's based on 1,000 different minuscule observations. Little tiny things that I pick up that individually don't really mean anything, but they all add together. And it's these issues stem from a desire to understand the underlying causes behind things. And once again, other people have explained this in a much more easy to digest way than I'm doing. I'm kind of just hip-shotting it as I'm going. There's no script. There's no pre-planning. Maybe I thought about a few things that I was going to say before I really got into it. And I know I'm staring off into space because I'm walking around my little apartment, which is unfurnished because I haven't ordered furniture yet. So what I did do is I got a desk and I grabbed a cot. And let me show you it. Why not? Yeah, it's a mess. I've got so much work to do before I get this thing into the kind of shape to where I'd actually want someone to come in here and see the place. It's a small studio. They called it a large studio, but it really is actually a small studio. But it's affordable. I make it all right amount of money, but I don't make all the money in the world. I'm not trying to spend a lot on a really extravagant place, so little kind of crappy studio apartment. But all the amenities work. It's got what I need. Comfy enough. And I guess this all kind of fits a little in with the INFJ thing. We don't really need all that many creature comforts when it comes right down to it. Probably the motivation I'd have for properly furnishing and decorating this wouldn't even be for me. It'd be for whoever came by. I'd want to furnish and decorate this seedy little studio and try to pretty up and make it look like more than what it is for the sake of the other person, so they don't come off with a bad experience or a bad impression. I don't want them to walk into my studio and not enjoy it. Although considering this place, that'd probably be impossible. But I'm digressing again. So, introverted intuition. This weird percolation of unconscious ideas and concepts and abstraction. You know, being able to see meanings in things. Meanings that really only make sense to the individual who sees them. You know, they're unique to each person. But the thing about having introverted intuition as a dominant function versus introverted or extroverted sensing as a dominant function is that, okay, so if you're a sensor, perceiving the reality around you, perceiving the world around you is a relatively straightforward experience. If you're extroverted sensing, you're centered on gathering in new information. Your brain is wired to want to gather in as much new stimulus as possible, as many new details. Just gather. That's the principal mode of perceptive function. And with introverted sensing, it differs, although not as much as for an intuitive, let me tell you that. It's not about gathering in all this information for the sheer sake of gathering it. It's gathering it in to compare it to previously experienced perceptual data. Might have this wrong. This is based off of some admittedly rusty reading. But introverted sensors like to compare their current perceptual data or datum with previously experienced, kind of as a check system. So those are the big differences between extroverted sensing and introverted sensing as I understand it. In both cases, perception of reality is a straightforward function. You take in the information as it is, process it, and then you make a decision based on what your decision-making function is. So that's relatively easy. For instance, an extroverted sensor with introverted feeling as an auxiliary function is going to take in extroverted sensory information, constantly gathering it from the periphery, from whatever their senses bring in, at a very surface, concrete level, seeing things purely as they are and not going any further with it. And then we'll make a decision based on internal values. By internal values, I mean subjective values. Values that are determined by that person. Basically, values that make sense to them. Those values don't necessarily have to make sense to anyone else. They're subjective and personal. So that would be like an ESFP, if I have that right. ESFP is going to be an extroverted sensor with introverted feeling. I think extroverted thinking, and then probably introverted intuition. I don't know. I have to look up all this crap. I don't spend all my fucking days just looking up MBTI stuff. I've actually taken a pretty long break from it because I've been focusing more on work and getting the lease signed for this apartment and other stuff that has to take priority. But tonight, I kind of needed to get this out here. Okay, so straightforward processes with a sensor. It is very different with an intuitive because even though introverted intuition is our dominant cognitive function, it's how our brain likes to process the reality we experience. But here's the thing. We still have to use our senses. We still have to use our eyes, ears, nose, taste buds, tactile sensation, sense of touch. We still have to use all those senses, and our function, which governs the reception of those senses, is extroverted sensing. The lead process in a sensor, particularly an extroverted sensor, that they're dominant with and most comfortable with, the constant gathering of concrete sensory detail out of the reality they're in order to process it and make a decision, a judgment, for the purposes of taking an action. The thing that's easy for them is hard for us because extroverted sensing is an inferior function. It is the least developed function in our brains. It is the function we have the most difficult time dealing with because we don't like being overwhelmed by stimuli. Now I'm saying we. How the hell that happened? I don't like being overwhelmed by too much stimuli. To use examples from personal experience, I'm really uncomfortable with going into crowded environments. I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. Try to avoid it when I can. I can function and get by, but it's very uncomfortable, very straining. Like, I used to think I was I'm just prone to anxiety attacks. Because that's what going into a crowded, chaotic environment is like for an introverted intuitive. And I feel for the ones who are not as well equipped as INFJs are to go into that, because we've kind of got a weird, conflicted and contradictory nature, which means that we don't like being overwhelmed by too much stimulus, which means we don't like those crowded, chaotic, noisy environments with lots of people. Because all that means is that we have a tremendous amount of sensory information that is constantly bombarding us. And our function that's delegated to that, to receiving all that information coming from your senses and processing it, is the weakest one. It gets overwhelmed easily. And when it gets overwhelmed, it causes stress and strain. Those feelings of anxiety I was having, that's because being in those crowded environments is forcing my brain to function in a way that it does not normally want to do. It does not normally want to have to deal with all these packets of perceptual data coming at it at once. It's like my buffer gets overwhelmed. And for an INFJ, the way we process reality is kind of roundabout compared to a sensor. So we take in the information through that inferior often underdeveloped, sometimes barely adequate extroverted sensory function. But instead of just taking it in through that and then making a decision, what happens is that it gets plugged into our dominant function. Basically, all that sensory information gets received through the inferior function, and then it goes into our dominant introverted intuitive function, which tries to take all that concrete perceptual data and tries to assign it, tries to translate it or recode it, for lack of a better word, into abstract concepts, symbolism, and meanings. Basically, for an introverted intuitive, every moment of our lives, we are literally having to translate the reality that sensors are comfortable with existing in into a reality that we are comfortable with. That's our natural state. Taking simple things that for most people don't have any real special meaning. And what we do is we end up assigning it. Like, take not really a good analogy, because honestly the power adapter isn't really vibing much, although actually something came to it, power, life, power is life. Without power, a lot of people will end up dying. In this day and age, in this society, electricity is about as necessary as food, water, and oxygen. Without it, a lot of people end up perishing, especially the weak, the old, the feeble, the sick and the ill, the young. Nowadays, most people are very poorly equipped to live in a world without modern amenities. I see what I just kind of did there. That was kind of, I guess, an INFJ thing. I took something very, very mundane, which in and of itself doesn't have any meaning, and I assigned it one. I assigned it life. And that's a very crude and very inelegant way of doing that, of assigning an abstract concept or an idea to an object. But that's how an INFJ thinks. The first thing he's going to think of, and it's not thinking, it just, it comes there when I look at any given thing. Yes, I'll see what it is, and usually if I'm with someone, I simply call it what it is. But in my mind, what I'm seeing is a symbol, a representation. Because introverted intuition wants to simplify things. It wants to take complex data and essentially trim the fat off of it. Because for an introverted intuitive, they can literally take an extremely complex idea or notion, like something with layers of depth and complexity, and they can literally WinZip it, compress it down, reduce it, slap a label on it, which is the symbol, the abstraction, and say, okay, that is what that is. I trimmed off all the other things that weren't important, that I don't need to understand this. That's what introverted intuition likes to do. It likes to get a complete and full understanding of something, and it does that by removing anything extraneous that doesn't contribute to that understanding. You know, in the case of people, in the case of myself, in my attempts to understand other people, I often catch myself attempting to psychologically profile or understand someone, basically psychoanalyze it, I guess you could call it, for the purposes of taking that person, summing up the entirety of themselves, cutting out anything that isn't contributing towards understanding them as a whole, and then putting a label on them. Label is kind of it's not fair. It really isn't fair to say that people like me label other people. No, it's assigning a representation. You know, and the word symbol seems inadequate because, you know, symbol doesn't contain enough depth, enough nuance. It's not an adequate descriptor for what we assign to people and things. You know, like one thing I've noticed is that I have a strong tendency, like if someone's explaining something to me, I have a tendency to take what they say and kind of sum it up in a very short, concise manner. You know, the shortest possible concise explanation that gets the point across. You know, like someone will walk me through the process of, say, some gardening, and they'll give me step-by-step information about, say, how to trim and how to prune and how to basically tend to plants and bushes and trees properly, because I do have a pretty strong interest in gardening. I don't have any plants yet. We'll get there. We're gonna get there. But yeah, they'll give me these kind of long-winded, ultra-detailed, step-by-step directions, and I find myself often kind of just summing it up into a very concise statement that kind of really gets the gist of it, you know? Make it look pretty. Because I know what make it look pretty is. I know what it's supposed to look like. Like, that is probably the best way for someone to explain to me how to go about performing a task. Like, give me the idea of what it's supposed to look like at the end, overall, and usually I can kind of figure the rest out myself. Now, granted, some of it is due to trial and error, but INFJs work really well when they're given a good idea of what their overall objective is and what parameters they need to meet. Like they kind of function really well because they'll go about figuring out the steps themselves. Like it's give them an INFJ loves it when they're given a really good comprehensive explanation of what their goal is, what they're trying to accomplish. You know, they want to understand what they're trying to get done. You know, especially in the big picture. You know, bigger the better. Freaking, they want to know what their overall function is. You know, that plays to an INFJ strengths. Why? Because they will figure out on their own how to go about doing it. That's the really beautiful thing. That's one of the positive aspects of being an INFJ is this introverted intuition allows you to work very well with a good degree of autonomy because you don't really need to be led around by the nose or told specifically what to do on every single thing. You know, an INFJ will take the initiative to learn it themselves. And when they get puzzled, they often take the initiative to ask the questions themselves. And typically, I don't ask a lot of questions, you know, and that's because INFJs lead with that introverted, intuitive perceiving function. They like to take in, they like to receive the data. They like to come to conclusions based on perceived observation before they take an action. So usually they tend to wait a good long time before they ask questions. Like they'll wait until they think they're not getting any more useful information before they'll ask a question. You know, they're like if you're at say a seminar or a lecture, a lot of times an INFJ won't ask a question when the lecturer, you know, ends their lecture and, you know, ask if anyone has any questions. You know, often an INFJ won't ask any questions. They'll wait and they'll see what other people are asking. They'll wait for a couple other people to ask questions first. Why? In large part because when other people ask questions, it kind of gives us a framework to work off of so that we have an idea of what information we haven't already been given through receiving it passively, although it's not really passive. An INFJ's mind is very actively engaged in this process. Call it passive because they're not acting out. They're not vocalizing. They're not conveying information out there. They're just they're receiving it all and then processing it through that introverted intuitive function. You know, letting all that information filter through them. So often what they'll do is they will wait for someone else to ask a question or even a few people to ask questions. And then again, a lot of this I'm deriving from my own personal experience. What they'll kind of do is use those questions as building blocks for their own questions. You know, because a lot of times what will happen is an INFJ will suddenly have a question after a few other people have already asked questions that they didn't even know that they wanted an answer to. It's like it circles back to near the start of this video where I said I felt that I was coming to an answer to a question that I didn't know I was asking. And a lot of ways it literally is like that. INFJs do and do not ask questions. It depends a lot on the circumstances. Like when the INFJ knows what information they're missing, they will be the first ones to ask questions. And their questions will be very to the point. The INFJ will know exactly what missing information they want. They will know what they want to hear from the person in terms of information gathering. They'll be very specific and very concise. And I'm getting bothered by a text again, so we'll just call this part 1. We'll see if there's a part 2 and where it goes from there. All right, catch you all later.